You ever notice how some people don't rush to correct misunderstandings about themselves? Someone thinks they're quieter than they really are, or colder, or less ambitious, and instead of jumping in with, "No, that's not me," they let it sit. They smile, change the subject, they move on. And maybe you've done this too. You let people underestimate you a little. You don't fully explain your intentions. You don't correct every wrong assumption, not because you can't, but because, strangely, it feels safer that way. Safer than being fully known. Safer than being fully seen. If that made you feel slightly called out, stay with me, because this isn't about insecurity in the obvious way. It's not about shyness or social anxiety or low confidence in the textbook sense. There's a quieter psychology underneath this habit, one that's thoughtful, strategic, and often misunderstood itself. Today, we're looking at the psychology of people who feel safer being slightly misunderstood, and by the end, you might understand a habit you've never quite had words for. Let's start with a familiar scene. You're in a conversation. Someone makes a mild assumption about you. Not an insult, not flattering either, just incomplete. Maybe they think you're less emotional than you are, or more serious, or that you don't really care that much. You notice it instantly. You could clarify, you could add context, you could say, "Actually, it's more complicated than that." But instead, you don't, and the moment passes. For some people, that silence isn't accidental, it's protective. One common profile here is the quiet boundary setter. This is the person who learned early on that over-explaining invites intrusion, that the more you define yourself out loud, the more others feel entitled to weigh in, interpret, correct, or challenge you. So they keep parts of themselves lightly out of reach. Imagine someone at work who's capable, perceptive, deeply thoughtful, but plays slightly smaller than they are. They don't advertise their ideas unless asked. They don't correct the assumption that they're just doing their job. And they definitely don't reveal how much they're actually tracking. Psychologically, this is about control. When people misunderstand you just a little, you retain narrative power. You get to decide when and if you reveal more. There's safety in that asymmetry. If others don't fully see you, they can't fully judge you, pressure you, or box you in. For this person, being misunderstood isn't a failure, it's a boundary. If this resonates, you might recognize the subtle relief that comes from not being fully defined, from not having to live up to an image you didn't choose. Then there's another type, quieter but heavier, the emotional minimalist. This person learned that emotional transparency doesn't always lead to connection. Sometimes it leads to confusion. Sometimes it leads to dismissal. Sometimes it leads to being told you're too much or overthinking. So they simplify. Picture someone who feels deeply but expresses lightly. They'll say, "I'm fine," when they're actually processing something complex, not because they're lying, but because translating their inner world feels exhausting and risky. For them, being slightly misunderstood is less painful than being poorly understood. There's a psychological concept here called emotional economy. When explaining yourself costs more energy than it returns, you stop trying, you conserve, you choose ambiguity over misinterpretation.
And here's the irony. These people are often incredibly self-aware. They're not emotionally closed off. They're emotionally selective. If you've ever thought, it's just easier to let people think what they think, this might be you. Now let's talk about a profile that's often mistaken for confidence, but is actually something subtler. The self-contained observer. This is the person who doesn't rush to correct assumptions because their sense of self doesn't depend on external alignment. They know who they are internally, and that feels sufficient. Imagine someone at a social gathering. Others project onto them. "You're so chill, you're mysterious, you don't care what people think." Some of those are accurate, some are wildly off. They don't fix it. Why? Because they're anchored inward. Psychologically, this is about internal validation. When your identity feels stable inside, you don't need every external mirror to reflect you perfectly. You're okay letting reflections be slightly distorted. There's also an element of curiosity here. Some people genuinely like watching how others perceive them. It gives them information about social dynamics, about assumptions, about projection. If you've ever thought, "It's interesting what people assume about me," rather than "I need to correct that," this profile might fit. But here's where it gets more complicated. There's another group, and this one is often misunderstood even by themselves, the preemptive protector. This person learned that being fully seen can lead to pain, rejection, envy, misuse. so they stay just blurry enough to avoid becoming a target. Think of someone who downplays their intelligence, their sensitivity, their ambition. They don't want to stand out too clearly. They don't want to invite expectations they didn't ask for. Underneath this is often a history, not always dramatic, but formative, a moment where being fully visible backfired, where openness led to vulnerability without safety. So now, misunderstanding becomes armor. It's not that they don't want connection, it's that they want control over how close others get. If you relate to this, you might notice a pattern. You're open in fragments, honest but not exhaustive, real but not exposed. And then there's the final twist, the one people rarely talk about. Some people feel safer being misunderstood because clarity feels like commitment. Once people really get you, they expect consistency. They expect you to stay that way, to live up to the version of you they've understood. But what if you're still evolving? What if you don't want to be pinned down? For these people, slight misunderstanding leaves room to change, to contradict past versions of themselves, to grow without explanation. Psychologically, this connects to identity fluidity, the sense that who you are is not a finished product and shouldn't be treated like one. So they avoid full definition, not out of fear, but out of freedom. Now, before this turns into a quiet celebration of being misunderstood, there's an important balance to name. There's a difference between choosing ambiguity and hiding. When misunderstanding becomes chronic isolation, when no one really knows you, safety can quietly turn into loneliness, and many people who live in this space feel that tension. They enjoy the protection. They also feel the distance. If this is you, the question isn't, should I explain myself more? It's, who is safe enough to understand me more? Because the instinct to protect yourself is not a flaw. It's information. It tells a story about your experiences, your values, your thresholds. And understanding that story is more important than correcting every assumption about you. So here's the reflection I'll leave you with. Do you let yourself be misunderstood because it feels calm or because it feels necessary? Is it a boundary or a habit you've never questioned? And if someone really did see you clearly, would that feel like relief or exposure? If this topic landed somewhere personal, you're not alone. And if you want to explore more of these quiet patterns, the ones that don't shout for attention but shape how we live, you know where to find them. Which of these felt most like you? Or maybe, which one surprised you the most? Let that question sit. You don't have to explain it to anyone.
And one more thing before you quietly move on. People who feel safer being slightly misunderstood often carry an invisible skill most others never develop. They read rooms better than they reveal themselves. They notice tone shifts. They catch what wasn't said. They sense when curiosity turns into judgment or when interest turns into expectation. That sensitivity is part of why full transparency feels risky, because when you see how quickly people simplify each other, you learn to stay just a little unsimplified. You may have noticed this pattern in how you answer questions. You give accurate answers, but not complete ones. Truthful, but not exhaustive. You don't lie. You curate. Someone asks, "How are you really?" You say, "I'm okay, just busy." And that's not false, it's just not the whole landscape. The psychology here isn't dishonesty, it's calibration. People who do this are constantly adjusting how much of themselves fits the moment, not because they're trying to manage impressions, but because they're protecting coherence. They don't want to fracture their inner world, trying to explain it to someone who's only half listening. And sometimes the misunderstanding itself becomes a filter. Those who stay curious will keep asking. Those who judge will move on. Those who demand clarity too early will reveal themselves. In that way, being slightly misunderstood acts like a quiet sorting mechanism. It shows you who is patient enough to know you slowly and who needs quick labels to feel comfortable. But there's also a private cost to this way of moving through the world. When you spend years being selectively visible, it can start to feel strange when someone
someone really does see you fully, accurately, without projection, it can feel invasive, even if it's loving. Some people in this pattern report a strange reaction when someone says, "I really understand you." Instead of warmth, they feel a flicker of alarm, as if something important has been exposed too quickly. That doesn't mean they don't want closeness. It means closeness needs pacing. If this resonates, it may help to think of understanding as something layered, not binary. You don't owe anyone the full map all at once. You're allowed to reveal yourself in chapters, not summaries. And here's the part that's rarely acknowledged. People who are comfortable being misunderstood are often deeply ethical about understanding others. They don't rush to define people. They don't flatten complexity. They know how it feels to be reduced, so they're careful not to do it to someone else. They leave space. That, too, is part of the psychology. So if you've ever felt slightly out of sync with a world that demands instant clarity, instant takes, instant self-definition, this isn't a weakness. It's a different orientation toward meaning. You value depth over speed, precision over performance, safety over spectacle. And that's not something that needs fixing. The real question is how consciously you're choosing it. Are you allowing misunderstanding because it protects your peace, or because you've never tested what happens when you let the right person see more? There's no universal answer, just an ongoing calibration between safety and connection. So as you sit with this, notice the moments this week when you choose not to explain yourself. Notice how it feels in your body. Relief, tension, neutrality. Those sensations are data. And if you want to keep exploring the quiet psychologies behind everyday behavior, the habits that don't announce themselves but quietly shape who we become, you're in the right place. You don't have to say much. You don't have to be fully understood, but you might start understanding yourself a little more.